You actually have the nerve to charge me $199. Victoria Sterling's voice cut across the garage like a blade, sharp enough for everyone nearby to stop and stare. She picked up the invoice and dropped it back on the counter like it was something dirty. She accused him of padding the bill, of taking advantage of being exactly the kind of small, desperate man who preyed on people who didn't know better. Then she got into her SUV and drove away without paying a single dollar. Less than 24 hours later, a black sedan pulled up in front of that same garage, and the man who stepped out was about to change everything. Ashford was the kind of town that didn't make the news. It sat quietly between two larger cities, connected by a state highway that most people only used to get somewhere else. The storefronts on Main Street had been there for decades, and the ones that hadn't closed yet survived mostly on reputation and loyalty. Callaway Auto, a garage tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store, was one of those places. The sign above the roll-up door was faded, the lettering worn down by years of sun and rain, but the shop itself was clean organized, and all was open before 7 in the morning. Ryder Callaway had owned the place for 11 years. He wasn't the kind of man who talked much about himself, and Ashford didn't need him to. People in town already knew his name, already knew what he charged and how he worked. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered with grease permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, no matter how hard he scrubbed. He wore the same style of gray work shirt every day, kept his tools in the same order, and priced every job the same way he always had parts, plus labor, nothing hidden, nothing inflated. He didn't upsell, didn't invent problems that weren't there, and didn't turn away a job because it wasn't profitable enough. That last habit was the reason the garage stayed busy, but never quite got ahead. He had built the place up slowly after his wife Carolyn passed away 5 years ago. What had once been a two-man operation with a part-time helper had become something he ran almost entirely alone, cutting costs wherever he could, without cutting corners on the work itself. The debt that came with the building, the equipment upgrades, the slow months, it all added up in ways that kept him awake some nights, staring at the ceiling and doing math he already knew the answer to. But in the morning, he was always back under a hood, always back with a wrench in his hand, because that was the only way he knew how to move forward. The town respected him for that, not in a loud, ceremonial way, just in the quiet, solid way that small towns reserve for people who show up consistently and never ask for anything in return. Mrs. Patton from the diner had once told him he was the most honest man in Ashford, and he'd shrugged it off the way he shrugged off most compliments, because he didn't think honesty was something worth praising. He thought it was just the minimum. It was a Tuesday morning when Victoria Sterling pulled into the lot. Ryder heard the vehicle before he saw it, the uneven idle of an engine that wasn't running right, the faint grinding that came and went when the driver touched the brakes. The SUV was a high-end European model, black and freshly detailed, except for whatever was wrong underneath it. The woman who stepped out was dressed in a fitted charcoal blazer, tailored trousers heels that had no business being on a garage forecourt. She was in her late 30s, composed in the way that people are when they've spent years making sure other people notice. She looked at the garage with the expression of someone who had expected something different and was already deciding how they felt about the disappointment. Ryder walked out, wiped his hands on a shop rack, and asked her what was going on with the vehicle. Victoria Sterling explained that the SUV had started making noise that morning and that her assistant had found this garage on the way to her next meeting. She made it clear without saying it directly that she wasn't the kind of person who usually ended up in places like this. Ryder didn't respond to that. He just asked her to pop the hood. He spent about 12 minutes looking it over. The brake line was the main issue, worn in one spot, in a way that hadn't failed yet, but would soon. There was also a loose heat shield rattling against the exhaust, which explained the grinding sound she'd been hearing. Neither job was complicated. Both needed to be done. He told her exactly what was wrong, explained what he'd do, quoted the parts and the labor, and gave her a total of $199. Victoria looked at the number. Then she looked at him. She said she'd wait inside her vehicle while he worked. She didn't ask any follow-up questions about the quote, didn't ask how long it would take, didn't say whether she agreed to the price. She just walked back to the driver's side and sat down with her phone. Ryder took that as a yes and got to work. He finished in just under an hour. The brake line was replaced clean, the heat shield secured, and he'd noticed the front left tire was sitting low, so he topped that off without charging for it. He filled out the invoice by hand, the way he always did, walked over to the SUV and knocked twice on the window. Victoria stepped out. He handed her the invoice, $199, the same number he'd quoted. Parts listed labor, listed nothing added. She looked at it for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not confusion, not surprise, but something closer to contempt, as if the number itself was an insult dressed up as a service charge. She picked up the invoice and looked at Ryder. "You actually have the nerve to charge me $199. Her voice was level, but loud enough. A man walking past on the sidewalk slowed down. The guy from the hardware store next door had stepped outside for air and was now standing still. $199 for what exactly? You replaced a part that costs $30 at any auto shop and tightened a bolt. That's it. That's your big job. Ryder told her calmly that the parts were itemized on the invoice and that the labor rate was posted on the sign by the door. He pointed to it. She didn't look at the sign. She dropped the invoice back onto the counter by the garage door, like she was returning something that had been handed to her by mistake. She told him she wasn't going to pay for work she hadn't agreed to in a shop she hadn't chosen at a price that no reasonable person would consider fair. She said the word reasonable, the way people say it when they mean the opposite, when they mean that they are the only reasonable person present, and everyone else should already know that. Ryder didn't raise his voice. He said that she had waited in her vehicle while he worked, that implied consent was standard in the industry, and that the price was the price he'd quoted before he started. He said it the way he'd say anything clearly without heat. Victoria picked up her keys from the counter. She told him that she didn't take financial advice from mechanics, that the bill was fraudulent, and that if he wanted to make something of it, he knew where to find her, though she said it in a way that made it obvious she was certain he did not in fact know where to find her, and that even if he did, nothing would come of it. She got into the SUV. The engine started clean. The brake noise was gone. The heat shield was silent. She pulled out of the lot and turned onto the highway without looking back. The man from the hardware store watched the SUV disappear down the road. He looked at Ryder. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that Ryder didn't already know. Ryder stood in the middle of his lot for a moment. He looked at the invoice still sitting on the counter. $199. He picked it up, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went back into the garage. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no music, no one watching, no one waiting to see what he'd do. He sat down on the rolling stool he kept next to the main lift and thought about it, the way he thought about everything plainly without sentiment. He could call an attorney. The case was simple enough, the work was done, the quote had been given, the vehicle was fixed, and she'd driven it away without complaint about the quality. Small claims court would have sided with him probably. He had witnesses. He had a signed-in vehicle, a dated work order, and a man from the hardware store who'd watched the whole exchange. But he also knew what happened when someone with Victoria Sterling's kind of money and connections decided to fight back. He knew what a bad review from the right person could do to a small shop in a small town. He knew how quickly a story could get turned around. He wasn't afraid of her exactly. He was realistic about what a fight like that would cost him, not just in legal fees and time, but in energy, in distraction, in the weeks and months he'd spend thinking about someone he'd never see again instead of doing the work that kept the lights on. So he made the choice that most people said they would never make, and almost everyone actually does make in the end. He let it go. He didn't tell himself it was noble. He didn't make a speech in his own head about taking the high road. He just decided that the $199 wasn't worth becoming the kind of man who spent his days fighting battles that made him bitter. He'd rather absorb the loss and keep his focus where it belonged. He believed not with any great certainty, but in the way you believe in things you can't prove, that the way you move through the world eventually comes back to you. Maybe that was naive. He was aware that it might be. But he'd built everything he had on that idea, and he wasn't ready to give it up over $200 and a woman in a charcoal blazer. He pulled the invoice out of his pocket and wrote one word across the top in pen closed. Then he filed it in the drawer with all the other paperwork and went back to the car he'd had sitting on the lift since before Victoria arrived, a 12-year-old pickup belonging to Dale Mercer, a retired school custodian who'd asked him 3 times to just tell him the truth about whether the truck was worth fixing. Ryder had told him the truth each time. The truck was worth fixing, not because it was cheap, but because Dale had driven it for 230,000 miles, and the engine still ran well. That was worth something. He worked on Dale's truck until the sun was low and the lot was in shadow. He closed the roll-up door shut off the lights, and the bay washed his hands at the utility sink in the corner. The water ran gray and then clear. He dried his hands on a clean towel, grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, and locked up. The town was quiet outside. The hardware store was dark. The laundromat was still going, the machines visible through the window, turning in the yellow light. A few cars moved slowly down the highway. Ryder walked to his truck, which was parked along the side of the building the way it always was, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about the $199 once more. Not with anger, not even with disappointment exactly. Just with the particular tiredness that comes when you do the right thing and it costs you, and you have to sit quietly with the knowledge that doing the right thing and getting rewarded for it are not the same thing and never promise to be. Then he started the truck and drove home. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that 8 miles away in the dining room of a house that cost more than his garage would earn in a decade, a woman named Victoria Sterling was sitting across from her father, and almost without meaning to telling him exactly what had happened that afternoon. Theodore Sterling was not a man who ate dinner in silence. He had built 3 companies from the ground up across 4 decades, had sat across negotiating tables. From people who made careers out of intimidation, and had long ago developed the habit of reading a room the way other men read a balance sheet, quickly, accurately, without sentiment. So when his daughter arrived at his house that Tuesday evening and sat down at the table with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided they were right about something, he noticed it the way he noticed everything, without comment and with full attention. Victoria had not come to confess. She'd come for dinner the way she did most Tuesdays, and the story came out sideways, the way stories do when someone is telling them to confirm their own version of events, rather than to be questioned. She mentioned the garage because the car was running fine. Now mentioned the invoice because the amount had irritated her. Mentioned the mechanic because she wanted her father to agree that what she'd done was reasonable. She laid it out efficiently, the quote, the work, the bill, the argument, the departure. She used the word fraudulent twice. She did not mention the witnesses. She did not mention that the noise was gone from the vehicle, and the brakes responded cleanly for the first time in weeks. Theodore listened the way he always listened, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face. When she finished, he didn't nod. He didn't agree. He asked her one question. Did the car work after? Victoria said that wasn't the point. Theodore said he understood, and then he didn't say anything else on the subject for the rest of the meal. Victoria took that as agreement. It wasn't. She knew her father well enough to know the difference somewhere underneath the certainty she'd arrived with, but she let herself believe what was easier to believe. After she left, Theodore sat at the cleared table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and thought about the story she'd told him. Not the version she'd intended to tell, the one about a billing dispute with a small-town mechanic, but the version underneath it, the one she hadn't meant to include. A man who had quoted a price before starting the work. A man who had fixed the car correctly. A man who had, by every account his daughter gave without realizing it, done exactly what he'd said he would do for exactly the amount he'd said it would cost, and then stood there without raising his voice, while someone publicly told him he was a fraud. Theodore Sterling had spent 40 years making decisions about people. He had learned slowly and at some expense that the most important information about a person wasn't how they acted when things were going well. It was how they acted when they had every reason to act badly and chose not to. Victoria had handed him that information without understanding what she was handing him. The next morning he made a call. He had a man named Gerald Watts, who had worked with him for years, not as an investigator exactly, but as someone who was very good at finding out things that mattered. Theodore gave him the name of the garage, the name of the town, and asked him to spend a day finding out who Ryder Calloway actually was. Not his credit score, not his business filings, not anything that existed on paper. Theodore wanted to know who the man was in the place where he lived, who knew him, what they said, what he'd done that nobody had been asked to pay attention to. Gerald called back late that afternoon. What he reported wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no single defining moment. What there was instead was a pattern, consistent, quiet, unremarkable in the way that genuinely good things often are. The owner of the laundromat next door said Ryder had fixed her delivery van twice in the past 3 years and had charged her for parts, only waving off the labor, because as he'd told her, she was alone running a business, and he understood what that felt like. A retired teacher named Harlow Webb had said Ryder had spent an entire Saturday helping him get an old truck running again, had refused payment, and had left before Harlow could argue about it. A woman at the diner, Mrs. Patton Gerald, said, who seemed to know everyone in the town, had said that Ryder Calloway was the most honest man in Ashford, and that she'd known him for over a decade and had never once seen him act differently in private than he did in public, which she said was rarer than people wanted to believe. Gerald also mentioned that the garage was struggling financially, not catastrophically, but visibly the kind of slow pressure that accumulated from being a fair business in a market that increasingly rewarded volume and speed over quality and honesty. The large chain service centers on the highway were pulling customers who didn't know better or didn't care. Ryder was carrying debt on the building on equipment and on a loan he'd taken 2 years ago to cover a slow winter. He was current on everything. He hadn't missed a payment. But the margin was thin, and the amount Victoria had refused to pay wasn't trivial in the context of what he was managing. Theodore thanked Gerald and set the phone down on his desk. He sat in his office for a while looking at the framed photograph on the wall that had been there since he moved into the building, an image of the first shop he'd ever owned, a small fabrication place in a town not entirely unlike Ashford. He'd been 26 years old in that photograph. He remembered what it felt like to do good work and have someone treat it as worthless. He remembered what it felt like to have the math work against you, no matter how carefully you ran the numbers. He had not thought about that time in years, and he found now that thinking about it produced something he hadn't expected. Not nostalgia, but recognition. Meanwhile, 8 miles away in the direction of Main Street, Ryder was doing what he always did. He had opened the garage at 6:55 in the morning. He had 3 jobs lined up for the day: a transmission flush on a sedan belonging to a young woman who drove 40 miles each way for work, an oil change on a vehicle that was overdue by several thousand miles because the owner had been putting it off, and a set of rear brake pads on a pickup that belonged to a man named Carl Briggs, who had already told Ryder he needed to be honest about whether the rotors needed replacing too. Ryder had looked at them the day before during a quick inspection and had already decided they were fine for now, which he would tell Carl directly, which would cost him an additional $240 in revenue he could have justified charging. He didn't think about Victoria Sterling while he worked. Or rather, he thought about her the way you think about something that's been filed away, not with active attention, but with the low-level awareness that it was there unresolved. The unpaid invoice sat in his mind, the way a small stone sits in a shoe, not painful enough to stop walking, but persistent enough to notice with every step. He'd absorbed losses before. The math of running a small business meant you absorbed losses regularly, and you learned not to let any single one of them become the story you told yourself about your life. But this one had a different quality. It wasn't just the money. It was the way she had looked at him when she picked up the invoice, not like she was disputing a number, but like she was evaluating a person and had already decided the value was negligible. He knew that kind of look. He'd seen it before from other people in other contexts, and he'd made a decision years ago not to let it change how he operated. But knowing that and feeling nothing were different things. And by midday, he was aware of a heaviness that had nothing to do with the work. He ate lunch sitting on the tailgate of his own truck, a sandwich he'd made that morning, a bottle of water from the cooler inside the shop. The lot was quiet for about 20 minutes. He watched the traffic on the highway, the same trucks and sedans and commuters that moved through Ashford every day without slowing down. He thought not for the first time about what the garage would look like in 5 years if things kept going the way they were going. The chain service center on Route 11 was already pulling away the quick turnaround jobs. If it pulled the regular customers too, the math stopped working entirely. He was not a pessimist, but he was a realist, and realism required him to sit with the numbers honestly, rather than pretend they said something they didn't. That evening at home, he found a piece of paper on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there when he left in the morning. The handwriting was uneven, in the way of someone writing quickly, and from the heart, rather than carefully. He stood in the kitchen and read it. The note said, "Dad is the best dad. Everything will be okay." There were stars drawn around the edges, each one slightly different from the last. He set the note on the counter where he could see it while he made dinner. He didn't know what had prompted it, maybe nothing more than the particular instinct some people had for sensing when a house needed something said out loud, even if no one had spoken yet. He stood at the stove and thought about the fact that the thing sitting on his counter was worth more to him than the invoice in the drawer at the garage, and then he almost laughed at how obvious and embarrassing that was, and how true it was anyway. He went to bed at 10:30. He had jobs starting at 7. The phone was on the charger on the nightstand. He lay in the dark for a while looking at the ceiling and made the same quiet calculation he made. Most nights was he still doing the right things, was the way he'd handled the situation with Victoria. Sterling the response of someone with integrity, or the response of someone who had simply run out of energy for conflict. He wasn't sure the two things were always different. He decided he was okay with not being sure. He turned onto his side. He closed his eyes. He did not know that across town, in a study with dark wood paneling and a single lamp on a mahogany desk, Theodore Sterling had already made a decision, and that the decision was in its own quiet way irreversible. He did not know that a man he had never met was sitting in a chair, looking at the photograph of a shop he'd owned 40 years ago, and thinking about what it meant when someone kept doing the right thing, even when the right thing cost them. He did not know any of it. He just knew that tomorrow he had a transmission flush at 7, an overdue oil change at 9, and a conversation with Carl Briggs about rotors that were fine for now, but wouldn't be forever. He knew how to do all of those things. He knew how to do them well. That was enough to fall asleep on, and so he did. What came next, he never could have predicted, not in any version of the math he ran that night, or any night before it. The black sedan pulled into the lot at 8:17 in the morning. Ryder was already under the hood of the sedan, belonging to the young woman who drove 40 miles each way for work, the transmission flush he'd had scheduled since the day before. He heard the car pull in, but didn't look up immediately because people pulled in and out of the lot all morning, and most of them were just turning around. It was only when he heard the door close with the particular solid sound that expensive cars make. Not a slam, not a click, but something in between that spoke of weight and engineering that he straightened up and looked. The man who stepped out was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. He was tall, lean, in the way that some men get as they age, without losing the sense that they once occupied more space. He wore a dark overcoat despite the mild morning, and he moved across the lot with the unhurried confidence of someone who had long ago stopped feeling the need to explain his presence anywhere. He looked at the garage front, at the faded sign at the roll-up door that was standing open, and then he looked at Ryder. Ryder set down his wrench and walked out to meet him. The man said his name was Theodore Sterling. He said it the way people say their name when they expect it to land with some weight. And then he watched Ryder's face with the patience of someone who was used to waiting for reactions. Ryder knew the name not from any personal connection, but from the way you know certain names in a region if you pay attention to local business news at all. Sterling Capital, a few commercial developments in the county, a name that appeared on buildings and donor plaques, and the occasional profile in the regional paper. He knew the name, and he knew what it represented, and he felt something tighten slightly in his chest that he recognized as wariness rather than fear. He told Theodore it was good to meet him, and he meant it to be neutral because he didn't yet know what the man wanted. Theodore said he'd like to talk if Ryder had a few minutes. Ryder said he had a job on the lift but could take a break. He gestured toward the 2 metal chairs he kept just inside the open bay door for when customers wanted to wait out of the sun. Theodore looked at the chairs with the expression of a man who had sat in boardrooms for 40 years and had absolutely no objection to sitting in a metal chair in a garage. He sat down. Ryder pulled the other chair around and sat across from him. Theodore said he was Victoria Sterling's father. He said it directly without preamble, the way you say something when you want the other person to have the full context before you say anything else. Ryder kept his expression even. He said he'd gathered as much from the name. Theodore asked him to tell him what happened. Not his daughter's version, he said he already had that one. He said he wanted to hear it from Ryder, in whatever order made sense without leaving anything out, so Ryder told him. He started with the morning Victoria had pulled in the sound of the engine, the brake noise, the visual inspection. He described the, quote, $199 parts, and labor stated before he touched the vehicle. He described the work, the brake line, the heat shield, the low tire he'd filled without charging for it. He described the invoice, same number as the, quote, itemized, nothing added. And then he described what happened after her words, the way she dropped the invoice on the counter, the accusation, the departure. He told it without embellishment and without bitterness, the same way he would have told it to an insurance adjuster or a judge, as a sequence of events in order, with the facts in the right place. When Ryder finished, Theodore nodded slowly. He looked at the floor of the garage for a moment, the clean concrete, the tools on their pegboard, the lift with the sedan still sitting on it, and then he looked back at Ryder. He told Ryder that he'd spent the past day making some inquiries. He said it plainly without apology, the way someone says something when they've decided to be transparent about a thing rather than let it come out sideways. He said he'd asked someone to speak to people in the town who knew Ryder to find out what kind of man he was in the place where he lived. He said he wanted Ryder to know that up front, because what he was about to say came from that information, and Ryder deserved to understand where it came from. Ryder said nothing. He was listening. Theodore told him what Gerald Watts had found. Not all of it, but the shape of it. The laundromat owner, Harlow Webb, and the truck he'd spent a Saturday fixing without asking to be paid. Mrs. Patton at the diner. He described the pattern Gerald had described to him, a man who did the right thing consistently privately without making it a story. He told Ryder that in 40 years of business, he had met a great many people who were good at performing integrity when they thought someone was watching, and a much smaller number who seemed to be the same person, whether or not anyone was paying attention. He said he had developed, over those 40 years, a very particular respect for the second kind. Ryder felt something move through him that he didn't immediately have a name for. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't pride. It was something closer to the feeling of being seen accurately after a long time of being misread, of having someone describe you back to yourself in a way that matched what you actually were, rather than what someone had decided you must be. He didn't say anything because there wasn't a clean response to that, and he didn't want to give an unclean one. Theodore reached inside his overcoat and took out an envelope. He set it on the arm of the metal chair on Ryder's side. He said it was a check. He said the amount was $19 million. The number sat in the air between them like something that had not quite finished arriving. Ryder looked at the envelope. He looked at Theodore. He said very carefully that he didn't understand. Theodore told him that he ran an investment fund, had run it for over 20 years, that was structured differently from most. The public-facing part was straightforward capital deployed into businesses and real estate and the ordinary mechanisms of wealth generation. But there was a second component, smaller and entirely private, that Theodore had established after watching a business partner of his, a man of genuine quality, lose everything to circumstances that had nothing to do with his abilities or his character. Theodore had decided then that he wanted a structure that allowed him to direct capital toward people rather than just toward ventures. People whose record in their own communities demonstrated something that no pitch deck could demonstrate, that they could be trusted with resources they hadn't yet had access to, because everything they'd done without resources already said so. He told Ryder that he didn't give money to people because he felt sorry for them. He said the word sorry in a way that made clear it had no place in this conversation. He said he invested in people because he believed that character was the most undervalued asset in any economy, and that what Ryder had built, not just the garage, but the reputation, the relationships, the consistent choices over a decade, was exactly the kind of foundation that made an investment rational rather than sentimental. Ryder sat with that for a moment. He looked at the envelope again. He said he hadn't done any of those things, the favors, the hours, the waived labor, because he was building toward something. He said he'd done them because they were the right things to do in the situations where they came up, and he hadn't thought about them much afterward. Theodore said he knew that. He said, that was the point. Ryder picked up the envelope. He held it for a moment without opening it. The way you hold something when you're still deciding whether it's real. He looked at Theodore and asked him what he was supposed to do with $19 million. Theodore said that was entirely up to Ryder, which was also the point. He said the fund didn't attach conditions or timelines or reporting requirements. He said he'd found over the years that people who had spent a decade making good decisions with very little tended to continue making good decisions when they had more, and that the best thing he could do was get out of the way and let them. They sat in the metal chairs inside the open garage bay for another 20 minutes. Theodore asked questions about the shop, not in the way of a man conducting due diligence, but in the way of a man who was genuinely curious about how things worked. He asked about the lift, about the difference between the chain service centers and a place like this, about what a brake line replacement actually involved. Ryder answered him the same way he answered everyone, directly and without condescension, assuming the person asking wanted real information rather than a simplified version. Theodore listened the way he had listened at dinner, with full attention, both hands still. When Theodore stood to leave, he shook Ryder's hand with a grip that was firm and brief. He said he expected Ryder would figure out what to do. He said it without irony, as a statement of confidence rather than a challenge. Then he walked back across the lot, got into the black sedan, and drove out onto the highway. Ryder stood in the bay doorway and watched the car until it was out of sight. Then he looked down at the envelope in his hand. He went inside, sat on the rolling stool next to the lift, and opened the envelope. The check was exactly what Theodore had said it was. $19 million drawn on a private fund, made out to Ryder Calloway. The signature at the bottom was clean and unhurried. Ryder read every line of it twice. Then he set it down on the workbench and sat looking at it for a long time. The way you look at something that has changed the shape of everything around it, and you need a moment before you can start to understand the new shape. He finished the transmission flush. He did the oil change at 9. When Carl Briggs came in at 11 for the brake pads, Ryder told him what he'd told him before: the rotors were fine. For now, no need to replace them. The pads alone would do the job. Carl thanked him the way he always did, with the slight surprise of a man who had been overcharged before and still hadn't fully adjusted to the alternative. Ryder waved him off and got to work. He didn't tell anyone about the check that day. In the weeks that followed, he moved carefully. He talked to an attorney, then to an accountant, then to the attorney again. He verified everything: the fund, the legitimacy of the instrument, the terms, all of it. Not because he doubted Theodore, but because being careful with something real was different from being suspicious of something false. And Ryder had always believed in doing things right the first time. The check was legitimate. The fund was legitimate. Everything Theodore had told him in those 20 minutes in the metal chairs was exactly as he'd said it was. He paid off the building debt first, then the equipment loan, then the smaller obligations that had been sitting on his books for 2 years, accumulating interest in the background of every month that wasn't quite enough. When those were gone, he sat with a number in front of him that was still very large, and he thought about what Theodore had said, that it was up to him, and that was the point. He expanded the garage over the following 6 months, not into something unrecognizable, but into something larger and better equipped. A second lift, a dedicated alignment station, a proper waiting area that didn't feel like an afterthought. He hired 3 mechanics, all of them young, all of them trained the way he'd been trained to diagnose, honestly, to quote accurately, and to never invent a problem that wasn't there. He set up an apprenticeship structure because he believed that the right way to do the work deserved to be passed on, and because there were people in Ashford and the surrounding towns who were willing to learn it if someone would teach them without charging them for the privilege. He established a fund separate from the business administered by a local nonprofit that covered basic vehicle repairs for people in the county who couldn't afford them. People who needed a working car to get to work, but couldn't get to work without a working car. The logic was simple. The need was real. He had the means now, and having the means changed what was possible without changing what was right. Victoria Sterling heard about all of it. She heard from her father first. Theodore called her, not to lecture her, but to tell her what he'd done, and why in the same direct and unadorned way he did everything. Then she heard from people in her professional circle who knew the Sterling name and had noticed the investment fund's activity. Then she read a brief piece in the regional paper about the expansion of Callaway Auto and the Repair Assistance Fund, neither of which named Theodore's involvement. She drove past the garage once about 4 months after that Tuesday. She didn't stop. She slowed down as she passed. The lot looked at the faded sign above the roll-up door. Still the same sign, still the same lettering, though the building behind it was clearly larger now, and then continued down the highway. She thought about the invoice she'd dropped on the counter. She thought about the word fraudulent, which she had used twice. She thought about the brake noise that had been gone from her vehicle before she'd even reached the highway that afternoon, and that she had not in the moment acknowledged. That last part was the one she kept coming back to. Not the money, not the argument, but the silence she'd chosen when the evidence was already sitting right in front of her. She didn't call Ryder. She didn't send a check for the original amount, though she thought about it. She understood that doing so now would be about her own comfort rather than any real repair, and that recognizing the difference was the more honest place to start. It wasn't a transformation. It was a shift in how she moved through certain rooms, and how she listened when someone quoted her a price. In the small but specific ways, she had begun to ask herself whether she was being accurate or just convenient. She didn't become a different person, but she became a more careful one. At the garage, the check was not framed or displayed. It had been processed through the appropriate accounts months ago, and now existed only in the documentation that Ryder's accountant kept in an organized folder in a filing cabinet that Ryder had never once opened himself. What was framed in a simple black frame, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, was the note he'd found on the kitchen counter The evening after Victoria Sterling drove away without paying. The uneven handwriting, the stars drawn around the edges, the message that said everything was going to be okay. It hung on the wall of his office, which was a small room at the back of the garage that smelled like motor oil and old coffee. He could see it from his desk when he sat down to do the books at the end of the day. He had never moved it to a better wall or replaced the frame with something nicer. It was already exactly what it needed to be, and he had learned over the course of his life to leave those things alone. The garage opened every morning before 7. The sign above the door was still faded. The work was still priced the way it had always been. Parts plus labor, quoted before the job started. No additions at the end. The lot was busier now, and the building was larger, and there were 3 mechanics inside who were learning to do it right. But the thing that had made any of it possible, the 11 years of showing up, of charging fair prices, of fixing the problem and not inventing a new one that hadn't changed, because it was never the kind of thing that needed to. It was just the way Ryder Calloway did things. It always had been. It turned out that was enough.